Okay, let's take a closer look at the tripod for the Vickers. Has two mounting points, one here at the front, which is underneath the main trunnion. Another one back here in the back, which is actually operates as the T&E mechanism made onto the tripod. You have a little basket here for the ammunition box to be placed in. It does detach very easily. It simply is held and rests in place by gravity. Alright, if you notice here on the sides, around the scale, you have little gradations. Alright, then you have a small little point right here that basically lines up with those so you can take a reading. Unfortunately, it's on the side, so you have to take a reading from the side of the firearm. One of the gun crews, or the number 2 or number 3 man, would have to do the reading for that. The gun can also be set up ahead of time and locked in place. You have a locking bolt right here on the front that you could lock the traverse in place. Of course, you have a wheel here towards the back that operates as your T&E mechanism. There is no scale on it. Basically what there is just marks all the way around this hand wheel, and you have a small little metal piece here in the bottom of the back edge that you line those marks up with. So the gunner can basically make his own calculations and mark these accordingly to mean whatever he wants. Typically, I think it means each one of these marks is 10 mils. Not sure. The tripod does have 3 adjustable legs. One right, one left, one here to the rear. So you can adjust for uneven ground and also for height requirements. Once again, here is your lock on the front that will lock in your traverse. What's also interesting to note is that on this Vickers tripod, you can also mount various other machine guns on this, including the Maxim, as well as the Browning 1919s and 1917. It is quite heavy, very heavy for to be carried, and typically, as far as in British gun crews, the main gunner, actually that fires the machine gun, would carry the tripod. The number 2 man, the assistant, would carry the firearm. So basically the gunner would position exactly where he wanted to place the tripod, place it in point, lock in the legs. Number 2 man would place the gun and prepare to load it, and number 1 would situate himself behind the firearm. On the downside, the Vickers actually had a dial sight that would mount to the actual gun itself. There was no scope of any provisions that would mount to the tripod itself, but the gun could be laid in to fire indirect fire overhead, and was quite successful at it during World War I. Okay, for the Browning, this is the M1917A1 tripod system. Had very good features on it. It was quite a bit lighter than the Vickers tripod as well. One of the nice features on it is that you don't have the cumbersome mount for the ammunition box. You had a small bracket here on the side that the wooden box or metal box with the accessory would actually just slide in place. Could be lifted off quite easily. It didn't hang out to the side and didn't really cause any problems. Another one is the removable piece right here that fit onto the trunnion of the actual Browning. You have a little locking tab here that would lock in place. You could pull it up, simply lift the gun off. This typically always stayed in place on the firearm itself. So the tripod would be carried like that. This would be onto the gun. When the tripod was laid in place, the gun was simply placed in place like that, locked in position. All right. You had your T&E mechanism here to the rear. Had various dial settings, pretty intricate for windage and elevation. You also had a nice elevation hand here that would actually allow you to move the gun up and down with gradation scale on the side for it. You also had here on the side your scale that went around the circumference of the tripod, and you had your reader just kind of like it was on the Vickers Mark I tripod. Of course, you have the adjustable legs, just like the Vickers tripod, adjustment for uneven ground or for height. The Browning had two pivot points and two mounting points as well. One back here on the T&E, which had a little pin that would go in place, and then one here on the front, as shown previously. You also had a traverse lock, just like on the Vickers, on the very front of the tripod. Overall, it was very much very good and handy as far as it being light and maneuverable. But the downside is that although there was a Browning derivative in a copy called the 1928 that was water cooled and looked very, very similar. It did have a scope, an optic sight that did mount onto the gun. Don't think I've ever seen one for the actual Browning. It was very rarely used in indirect fire. It was mostly direct. Although it did have some calculating tables that you could line it up and could execute overhead firing positions and tables, but I don't think it was used very often. Y'all may be able to correct me on that, but I have never seen a scope actually made for Browning 1917, 17A1s, or 1919s. Okay, here's the Browning sitting on its tripod system. As mentioned before, the ammunition box is located on the left. It feeds from the left-hand side of the firearm. The box is easily lifted off and a new one replaced. They are of wood construction. There were some metal ones that would also fit on this tripod. Later metal ammunition boxes had to have actually another bracket fitted on these slots to help accept it. Throughout World War I and World War II, the Browning used the cloth belts. The metal belts that you typically see nowadays, the metal belts were mostly used for aircraft purposes, the disintegrating links. But all throughout World War II and the Korean War, the Browning always typically used the cloth belts. And the only thing that the cloth belts had a disadvantage for mainly was they were susceptible to dirt, mud, and moisture. If they got wet, the cloth fabric would shrink and actually close too tight on these cartridges and make feeding a little bit difficult. You had a little small metal starter tab. The Brownings were chambered in 30-06, fed from the left-hand side, ejected straight out the bottom, and fired at typically around 600 rounds per minute. Okay, the Vickers fed from the right-hand side of the firearm, ejected out the bottom. They were chambered in British 303, the rimmed cartridge, and basically they typically ran right around between 450. They could achieve up to 600 rounds per minute, but typical and the norm was generally around 500 rounds per minute. Of course, you had your ammunition box here, had a two-piece lid on it that would cover the rest of the entire length to keep out rain or sand or dust. Could also be opened all the way up to expose the full belt. Typically during World War I and World War II, the British used a cloth belt. The first type that was used in World War I and actually still was used in World War II was this cloth belt here with brass tabs on it. This is the original old style here. These held 250 rounds, and this one's dated 1943 by Dunlop. This one here is also dated January 1943, but these are they were classified originally as disposable belts. That's not really true. They could be reloaded, but like all the other cloth belts, they tended to cause some problems when moisture or if they became damp. The plus side of this one here is that they did beefing up the stitching around each cartridge and eliminated the brass tabs that were bothersome. They would break or bend and have to be constantly maintained. So these were a high maintenance item. These were just a little bit more wear and tear, and they did use these all the way up through the 1960s when the Vickers was finally retired from active service. Typically you will not see any of the Vickers that were used in military service using metallic belts, but there are some out there that do work. The Russian Maxim actually has the same pitch and dimension as any of the British Vickers belts, so they can be used inside of the British gun. And vice versa. You can also use the cloth British belts inside the Russian Maxim, or even the German Maxim.